As teachers, we are bombarded with information of what we need to be doing in our classroom every single day. And this week, I received a question from one of you asking, where do I even start? So in today's episode, I'm going to be breaking it down into 3 steps of what I think every math classroom needs to have. And this is where your change can begin. So let's get started. Welcome to Solving for the Undefined podcast. I'm your host, Johanna, founder of Miss Kuiper's Classroom, the place that equips teachers in creating a healthy math classroom where students can thrive, no matter their academic abilities. But it's not always about the numbers, and that's why I'm here, bringing you the formulas to solve your problems, math and otherwise, plus strategies on cultivating that necessary math mindset. And that's what you can count on. Hello, welcome to a brand new episode. Today I'm going to be doing something new that I've never done before. I'm going to be sharing with you the audio of a presentation I gave about the 3 steps to student success. As you're listening, you're going to hear the 3 things that I think every math classroom needs to have, and therefore the place that we can start when we're ready to make changes within our classroom. Let's tune in. I'm Johanna Kuiper, and I'm super excited to be sharing with you 3 steps to get your students thinking. So right off the bat, let's talk about what those 3 steps are. 1, we have creating strategic groups. 2, using non-permanent surfaces for student work. And lastly, making math meaningful. Now we're going to dive into each of those 3 things and what they mean for us. When we're talking about strategic groupings, we're going to be talking about 2 things: the ideal group size and the way to create those groups. So the 3 options that you might have when you're creating your groups is partners, trios, and quads, or groups of 4. So partners are ideal for kindergarten, 1st grade, and 2nd grade. The reason I say partners is because they are still learning how to be social beings and humans. So having just one other person to interact with can be the ideal place for students in those grades. But as we get into upper elementary and beyond, 3s are where we see the most beneficial things for students. There's enough redundancy or similarity between students, but there's also enough diversity between them, whether that's culturally, academic levels, or other things. That is where there's enough redundancy and diversity. And I think it's kind of cool that 3 is where research shows that students work best, because 3 is like a triangle, and triangles are the most structurally sound shape in the world. So I thought that was pretty cool. And lastly, if we had a group of 4, it typically devolves into 2 pairs or a trio plus 1 more. And we want to make sure that inside of a group, if we want them to be a team, that everyone is being able to participate, everyone is seen, and everyone can be heard. And plus, when you get to that group of 4, you start to see there's a social aspect to it, like a group of friends hanging out, rather than we're here to do work and to build our math minds together. And so that social aspect can be hard to predict. So groups of 3 is what I'm recommending for the ideal group size. So here is a picture of what my classroom looks like in our groups of 3. So as you can see, they're all facing each other. I know sometimes people put 3 in a row, but really we want them to be facing each other. I know not everyone has the desks or the space to do this, but if you can, them facing each other is going to be the best. And the reason why is I used to do partners, and I used to have them facing forward towards me when I'm teaching. But I found when I had them try and do group work, because they're not naturally facing each other, it took a lot more effort for them to actually work together. But in this setting, because they're naturally facing each other, their inclination is going to be to work together. So it can be, I will tell you, it is a little bit more management on your part or on my part, because they're going to naturally want to talk to each other more so than listening to you. And if you have your classroom set up for group work already, this will be a natural transition for you. And you can see on the desk that there is a playing card taped down. That is their group determiner, I guess. So this will lead us into how to create our groups. Now, I used to make seating charts like this, and I thought they were absolutely fabulous because it's super streamlined. If I just needed to change 2 students, it's a sticky note, and I can change it and swap it anywhere I need to be. Or if students change classes, boom, move to another sheet. Super easy, low stress on my part. But I started doing something different, and that is random groups. Now, this is where those playing cards come in handy. I have, when students walk in, a deck of cards splayed out, and they'll choose a card, and that indicates what group they're in. So if I have the first person pulls a king, they're going to be in the kings group. Second is jacks. Now, a little tip as you may implement this in the future, 2 things. 1, you want the cards facing you rather than like a deck of cards in your hand. This eliminates the fact of students swapping cards because you're seeing what card they pick. They pick it, ooh, a king, nice. So you're verbally confirming with them, hey, I know what card you have. You're going to sit in this seat. And 2, if you have students who have IEPs or 504s that need them to be sitting in the front or near you, you can kind of divide it up into 2 hands. So in one hand you have all of the cards that correspond to the seats in the front or the groups in the front or the groups by you. You have that in one hand and all the others in the other hand. So when students come up, if they have the IEP in the front, you're like, oh, you're going to pick from this hand. And then if they're not, you can pick from the other hand. And then maybe once all the students in your class have picked from these, then you can like combine them together. Or just make sure that this is enough per students that have those specific plans. Just an idea. All right, so let's talk about why random groupings is more ideal than a created seating chart. When you're creating a seating chart, you have to calculate all of these different things. Are these 2 best friends? Are they going to be talking as they become a management issue? Do these people work well together? Or if you're teaching upper middle school and high school, have they dated and broken up? Is it no longer amicable? So you have to consider all of these different pieces when you're creating a seating chart. But when you're randomizing your groups, those things tend to be less important. So when you're creating random groups, as time goes on, students become more agreeable to work in any group. The social barriers, that's actually my second point, social barriers are lowered because throughout the course of, 6 weeks, they've probably worked with almost every single student in the classroom. So overall, their social barriers drop, the cliques kind of dissolve, and you become more of a community rather than individual students working with whoever they are. And when you have this idea of they're always going to be in a different group, it tends to promote independence and engagement because it's exciting. Every single day they're going to come to class and work with someone new and someone different. It's no longer like, oh, I have to work with this person every single day. I hate math class, blah, blah, blah. It's randomized, it's new, it's exciting every single day. So they have that engagement piece. And the reason why it promotes independence, again, independence off of me as the teacher. It might have like some codependence with their teammates, but it's not on me because, again, they're facing each other, they're working together. They are more likely to ask each other for help first than immediately coming to me when they have a question. So there's some ideas about random grouping. If you want to learn more about this, there's a book called Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics by Peter Liljedahl. This is where this idea comes from, this randomized grouping. So if you want to learn more about it, that is a book you should read. So now that we've talked about groupings, let's talk about using non-permanent surfaces. Number 2. So here's some of the research that Peter Liljedahl actually did regarding non-permanent surfaces. So you can see, try and move my head a little bit. So you can see here that he researches 5 different things: vertical whiteboards, horizontal whiteboards, vertical paper, horizontal paper, and notebooks. And with those things, the time to task is pretty easy, pretty even across the board. when you release students to do the work, pretty much all of them have the same time. But time to notation is where they kind of break off. When they're using whiteboards or randomly notebooks, their time to actually start writing, aka doing the work, is a lot quicker when they're given paper. And now, paper also refers to like worksheets or printed activities, which I thought that was very interesting. So using a whiteboard is more ideal than paper, and notebooks too. But as we go into eagerness, I'll move this way. Eagerness, discussion, participation, persistence, non-linearity, I think that's how you say it, and mobility, that's the last one, my chair's in the way. This is where whiteboards become superior to all of the other things. When we want students to begin thinking and have that independent thought, whiteboards are what we need to be using in our classroom. You can see here's the data that was found. Whiteboards promote eagerness, discussion, and participation. Those are the 3 things we need to get students thinking. So I'm going to be sharing with you 3 different styles of whiteboards you can be using in your classroom and how to use them. So let's talk about mini whiteboards. That is our first one. I feel like most classes, maybe that's just my school, have mini whiteboards in their classroom. Now, thinking about this, first thing that these do is it increases student work. Remember back on that last slide, it increases participation, discussion, timed notation. So whiteboards increase that. And so I used to use notebooks every single day for our warm-up. We'd create a diagram of 4 on our first page for every Monday, and we'd do 4 warm-ups throughout the week. And I was noticing that over time, students were not doing the work. They wouldn't even write down the problem. But as soon as I learned that maybe whiteboards might be a better place to do our warm-ups and we switched, the number of students who just did the work or wrote down the problem increased to almost 100% every single time. And now with this, there was an increased willingness to try the problem, even if they were unsure to start off with. They would write it down, they would try it out. And I think this is caused because it's easy to erase it if they feel they made a mistake or it was messy. But if they try to do that on a piece of paper, it's not as pretty when you erase it. But when a whiteboard is just smooth, clean, it's pretty remarkable, am I right? So there was an increased willingness and increase in student work. And lastly, something I thought was really cool is as I started to create this culture of we use whiteboards for pretty much everything, students were asking to use them for assessments. So we'd get a test or a celebration of learning, as I like to call it. Students would use whiteboards to do the work. They would then copy it down once they were happy with it, and then they were turning it in. And overall, like, scores increased. The mood level increased when we had an assessment because it wasn't as stressful of having to have a perfection or have perfection on paper because they could do it on a whiteboard first. So that is a little bit about whiteboards and how it increases student work. Now, before we move into the second one, I also use whiteboards for our discovery portion of a lesson. So I have kind of changed from, let's do it in our notebook first, and now you do a bunch of these problems. But we actually dive into the behind the scenes of why math is the way it is. And my first thing of doing this was with volume. And we started with the volume of a cylinder and looked into like, oh, hey, it's the area of a circle times the height. And then we kind of discovered from there what the area of a cone was and then the area of a sphere. And something super interesting that my students and I learned throughout this process was the formula for the volume of a sphere is 4/3 pi r cubed. But when you kind of discover it naturally, it's 2/3 of a cylinder that have the same radius and height. So 2/3 pi r squared is the formula when you find it through discovery. And so we were trying to think, times height, 2/3 pi r squared times the height. And we were like, how does that work with the given formula 4/3 pi r cubed? And we had to kind of think about it. Well, what is height for a sphere? Well, it's the diameter. What's another way to say diameter? 2 radius. 2 radius, so 2/3 times 2 makes 4/3. That extra r makes an r cubed. And that's how you get the 4/3 pi r cubed. And my students' minds were blown. But most of them, when we went to go do some practice problems, still used the 2/3 pi r squared times the height. And it was really cool that they were able to work through that together and come up with that. I use whiteboards to do discovery lessons, and we do what do you notice, what do you wonder on whiteboards. They practice on whiteboards, and overall increase work, increase willingness. All right, moving into our second one, dry erase sleeves. Now, if you do not use dry erase sleeves in your classroom yet, you need to, because this, remember how that research thing we looked at said that paper takes a really long time for students to start writing, their eagerness, participation, all of that is lower on paper. This is how you flip that around and make it erasable, make it a horizontal whiteboard, is with a dry erase sleeve. So you can take any worksheet, put it inside this dry erase sleeve. It's kind of like a thicker sheet protector, and it's a lot easier to erase than a sheet protector. So put a worksheet inside this dry erase sleeve and it becomes a whiteboard. Students are more eager and more willing to work on this. Plus, if you have a strict print budget, you just print one class set and you get to use it for every single class. Pretty awesome. So some of the ways that I use dry erase sleeves is, 1, worksheets that I want students to work through. I think this is one of our guided notes pages. 2 is, I call it like dice boards, but it's where students will roll a dice and create their own problem. Maybe create your own problem papers is a little bit nicer than dice boards. But the reason why I really like this is beyond that it's infinite problems, because they're just rolling dice and creating lines. Or I have it for other activities as well, or other concepts as well. But when they're inside their group of 3, and one person is doing this, they're rolling the dice, creating their linear equation, and then drawing the line. While they're doing it, their 2 partners are watching and critiquing the work. And not critiquing in like a negative way, but they're making sure that that person is drawing the line and creating the equation correctly. So there's a little bit of error analysis happening, as well as that one student creating the line. Now, if the student happens to make a mistake and the other student catches it, they're being able to use that analytic mind and be like, hey, I don't think this is quite right. How can we fix it? And they're practicing coaching and teaching someone else. And when you're teaching it, your brain remembers it better in the long run. Plus, I like to say we learn from mistakes, but they don't necessarily have to be our own. I should patent that. They'll take it and then they'll rotate it to the next person and rotate it to the next person. That way there's kind of like a cyclical thing happening. And then the last way I use it, which I always think is super cool, is word searches. I started this during our state testing this year because students would get done and they'd start a word search, and then class would be over, it'd be time to clean up, and they throw away a partially done word search. But the next day, they'd want a new word search to start again. And I was like, we aren't wasting paper. So I'd put the word search inside the dry erase sleeve. Then they can just use a dry erase marker over the words that they find. Mind blown. And I want to next year, with this idea, do any of my puzzles. So if I have maze papers, if I have Sudoku, Ken, tic-tac-toe, hangman, all of these different things I want to put in dry erase sleeves for my fast finishers. That way I'm not spending an infinite amount of money on things for them to do. It's in a dry erase sleeve. Infinite uses. Big brain, as students would say. So that is how I use dry erase sleeves in my classroom. And lastly, we have vertical whiteboards. Now this one is the one that I think I had the most trouble moving into because it was so different. I'd never had students use vertical whiteboards other than, hey, come show the class this problem. So I used vertical whiteboards for group work after learning. When I first started implementing it, I tried to do it in the midst of them learning this new idea or a new concept, and it flopped horribly. And maybe it was just my implementation of it, but having students at whiteboards and then trying to bring them all back, try something new, and then releasing them, classroom management nightmare. So I started doing it just after we did the discovery based, and now I want them to practice a bunch of problems with their team. So after they've done the discovery on their mini whiteboards, I will give them a problem and they'll go do it on their vertical whiteboard. Now, what I do is I have 5 problems. I typically have taken it from the book, copied it, cut them apart, and put them in a bucket in the center. And they're labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I will give the teams problem number 1. They'll work through it on their vertical whiteboard. And then when they're done, they can either have me check it if they feel like they need to, or 2, if they feel confident in their work, their process, and their answer, then they can just return it to the bucket and grab problem number 2. And one thing that I found using vertical whiteboards is it's really easy differentiation, because I'll make sure that problem number 1 covers the basis of what we're learning, and the other ones kind of build in level of ability, if that makes sense. They get it a little increasingly harder. So example, going back to the volume, maybe the first one was just volume of a sphere. But as they go on, it combines volume of a cylinder in with volume of a sphere and kind of builds on that. Maybe one of them is a composite shape. Maybe the last problem provides Pythagorean theorem as well as volume, kind of pulling some previous knowledge in there. So that's how I did the problems for the whiteboard. So some of the things that I found with the whiteboards is, yes, it's differentiation, but it's also really cool because I can stand in the center of the room, rotate around, and see how each group is doing. Are they stuck? Are they just talking? Are they having a really good academic discussion that I want to be a part of? It is so much easier than when students are sitting down in their groups. I love it. Plus, I'll get to this in a moment, I guess. Student engagement is increased exponentially when students are at whiteboards. Because they're standing, their oxygen is higher, their heart rate's higher, because when you sit, your heart rate will actually slow down. And that causes the brain to start to fall asleep, to relax. But when they're standing at whiteboards, they're not this way. And it really helped my wiggly students. So I had 2 this year that specifically, when they were sitting, were very distracting because they were moving so much. But when they were at vertical whiteboards, they were allowed that freedom more so, standing, being able to move around. It was really, really good for them. I had a specific student who, throughout the year, because they were very wiggly, very active, it was hard for that student to focus on what they were doing. They seemed to have some ADHD tendencies. But when they were up then at the whiteboards, they were very, very engaged and active and had very good academic discussions that student did not have when they were sitting down. Pretty awesome. And one time specifically, I had 2 students debating their answer, and it was so cool to see it because they were standing, they were having they were pulling people from other groups and having this very vibrant discussion that they probably would not have happened if they were sitting down. We already talked about embedded differentiation. So that is vertical whiteboards and just using non-permanent surfaces as a whole. So now we're going to talk about making math meaningful. Now I feel like this is the one point that we as teachers always strive hardest for, because society has a very negative view of math. If you watch any movie or TV show, most of the time you're going to see one of 2 things. 1, they're either going to be a super nerdy character who loves math, or 2, they're going to hate math very adamantly. So people usually fall in those 2 categories. There's no middle ground most of the time. So we are going against societal norms when we try to make math fun, exciting, and meaningful. So first thing I would suggest in making math meaningful and helping students think deeper is cut out mimicry and promote discovery. So I think I was very much in the mimicry category for a long time. I would have students in our notes, we'd take beautiful, elaborate notes, step-by-step processes, but I wouldn't allow students the discovery portion either first or while we were working together in the notes. And so when they would get to their notes or their practice time, they were just copy-pasting doing it. They weren't actually fully using their brain because they didn't understand the why behind the process. So cutting out the mimicry portion and promoting discovery. Something I want to implement this year, little tangent for you, is the Dear Future Forgetful Self. That's another thing Peter Liljedahl talks about in his book, is instead of creating notes first, at the end of a lesson, having students write a letter to themselves for their future self of what they learned and what they did. I think that'll be super cool to come back next year and tell you how it went. And then secondly, when we want to make math meaningful, we want to make it real world or outside the classroom connections. And I put this little pool to remind myself of a story I wanted to tell you. So this involves actually one of the Wiggly students I was talking about before. But we were doing our volume unit, and the question asked, how long would it take to fill this pool 4 feet? And this group came up with 17. And they were saying it was 17 minutes. It would take 17 minutes. And so talking with students about this, would it actually take 17 minutes? Does that make sense for it to take 17 minutes to fill a pool that big, 4 feet? And their answer was no. So this sparked in them that they had to go back and see what happened. How did they get that 17? Does that make sense? And revising their work. It created a connection that might not have been there if it was just, here's the cylinder, here's how tall, what is the volume? That kind of thing. Creates more connection, more meaningful, more meaning to it. And lastly, try out some open-ended and open-middle problems. Now, open-ended, let me see if I can get this right. Open-ended means that there's a structure to it, but the answer can be anything. Whereas open-middle has a specific start, a specific question, and a specific end goal, but how you get there can be anything. So I think that was a really cool distinction between those that I didn't know before this year. So using those two things allows students creativity and thinking deeper about problems because there's infinite possibilities. So what I have could be different than my neighbor or my other group member, and that's okay because all three of ours could lead us to the same place or be part of the same problem. So with that too, if you have a group of 3 and they each come up with a different answer, they can then check each other's work and be like, hey, that's so cool. Yours does the same thing mine does, just a different way. With this too, making math meaningful, I like to make sure that students have a bunch of different ways to do the same thing. So like before I talked about the volume, 2/3 pi r squared times the height, or 4/3 pi r cubed. Whichever way their brain works, awesome. And 2, solving equations is one of those things where there are so many different ways to do it, and whatever works best for a student, that's how they can do it. Which is another little bit of open-ended and open-middle. So in conclusion, we have 3 steps to get students thinking. Creating strategic groups, using non-permanent surfaces for student work, and 3, making math meaningful. Now, as we close out today's session, what's next? I have this guide, 7 math teacher must-haves for student success. And I have in that free ebook 7 different manipulatives, tools in your classroom that you need for students to be successful and to help them in their thinking. So there is a link down below where you can just click it and then download that free ebook. I think it's pretty cool. Plus, inside of it, I should mention, I think it's also pretty cool that I have links to these different resources, whether you are on a budget or you have some more money to spend. I've done the research, I've read all the Amazon reviews and figured out what is the best for a budget and what you could get if you have a little bit more money to spend. And then connect with me. I'm on Instagram every single day. You can find me at Miss Kuiper. And then if you were like, I want a little bit more than just watching your reels and interacting with your stories, I have a Facebook group called A Fraction of Math Teachers. And inside that group, I share a bunch of things that I do in my classroom to help students thinking, scaffolding, differentiation. I give free activities that I do with my students. So if you want to be a part of that, there's a link down below as well. You can join us in that group. And then lastly, I have a podcast called Solving for the Undefined. And that podcast, same as I did here, I share a lot about what I do in my classroom, how I do it, different things that I learn. I have guests come on and share their things. So if you want to learn some more, that is a great place to get started. And that's it. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, I'll calc you later. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. To find all the links and resources to things talked about in this episode, head on over to MissKuipersClassroom.com and click on podcast.